Learn a language like a child. It's a motto that's gotten pretty popular over the last few years in language learning communities. But why? We tend to have this idea that basically children can learn languages and adults can't. Like, you get this language learning license when you're a kid, but by the time you're 18 years old, you have to go to the DMV and they snip it in half, and then after 18, you can no longer learn languages. And a lot of us get this idea because we see, like, immigrant families, for instance, go to countries, and then the kid of the immigrant family seems to be able to pick up the language like nothing. In 2 to 3 years, they're speaking fluently, and the parent just seems to never learn. Why is that? A lot of people just say, oh, well, it's because kids can learn languages, and it's because parents can't. Parents got their little language learning cards snipped, and ever since then, it just doesn't work for them. I had a friend from Ukraine. She grew up in Ukraine, so she spoke Ukrainian and Russian. And then when she was 9, she moved to Turkey, and she learned how to speak Turkish. And then later in high school, she moved to the United States, and she learned how to speak English. So she speaks 4 languages fluently. And then when I knew her, around when she was 22, she went to a French language learning school for an entire year, and she couldn't learn French. So case in point, people who are adults just can't learn languages, right? But the lesson I learned when she told me this story wasn't that adults can't learn languages. It was, even if someone's learned 4 languages to a point where they're fluent, they still can be oblivious to how actually languages are learned. She didn't become incapable of learning languages after she became 20 or 21. That's not what happened here. The reality is, it wasn't that she just stopped being able to learn languages past the age of 20. What happened was, the 5th language she learned, French, was done in a drastically different environment than where she learned her first 4 languages to fluency. Think about first when she moved to Turkey at 9 years old. She would have been interacting 6 hours a day with teachers and students, trying to condescend to her level, trying to explain things to her at a level she could understand in the language they spoke. So for instance, a kid might say, "Do you want to play? Do you want to play?" Really trying to get her to understand what they meant. They might say, "Good job," when she did something good, or "No, don't do that," when she did something bad. And teachers, to see what she needs, might have asked her, "Do you need to go to the bathroom? Do you need to go to the bathroom?" They might have asked her, "What do you want for lunch? What do you want for lunch?" They might have mimed for her and overdone their expressions to try to get her to understand what they're saying and what they're asking. Now imagine doing that for 100 hours. If she was at school for 6 hours a day, it would only take 10 days before she had around 60 hours of input, 60 hours of interaction with people who were trying to communicate with her at a level she could understand. You can imagine that after 60, 120, 300, 500 hours, she might actually get pretty comfortable understanding basic messages in the language. And by a certain point, let's say at 100 days, after 600 hours of basic input in the language, she was probably able to understand some of the lessons that teachers were actually teaching her, which she obviously couldn't in the beginning because she didn't speak the language. But after 100 days, 200 days, 1,200 hours, she was probably finding it more and more easy to actually understand what the teachers were saying because of how much input she was exposed to at her time in the school. We could also probably imagine, without too much of a logical leap, that she was able to produce at least basic messages in the language by 1,000 hours, by 1,500 hours. She might have been saying, "I have to go to the bathroom." She might have been saying, "Yes, I want to play." She's probably able to speak the language and produce the language pretty well just because of all of the contact she's had with the language at a level she understood. Now, if we compare that to traditional French classes in her adulthood, we can see a huge difference in what she was actually doing day to day. In a traditional French class, obviously, for one thing, it's much shorter. She might have only had an hour for 100 days of French. And in that French class, she was probably taught grammar, she was probably taught vocab lists, she was probably made to speak before she actually really knew what she was saying. And these are all things she probably got very little of in actual Turkish school. I'm sure she might have done some grammar, but the reality is kids go to schools already being able to speak their native language without any grammar. So she probably did some grammar, but in the French class, grammar was probably much more important to her her every day. So she might have learned a lot of rules about French, about how French should be spoken and all these things, but she wasn't actually probably getting much authentic input at all. Even if, let's say, they played a clip of French for 5 minutes a day, even if we assume it was basic enough for her to understand it, that's 5 minutes a day for, let's just say, 100 classes. That's nothing compared to the actual amounts of immersive input she would have been getting in Turkey. So the reality is, she didn't just forget how to learn languages when she was 20 years old. The experiences she had as a child were way different than the experience she had as an adult. And this is why adults and children seem to learn differently, because the environments that children are in are way more conducive to language learning than the environments adults are in. If an adult goes to a foreign country, people are not trying to get on their level and explain things in very basic, simple ways. Adults have way more expectations thrust on them, and when they're given input, it's at such a high level that they have to default to translators. They don't have any time to actually try to learn the language because the input they're being given is just at such an advanced level, they have no hope of learning. And adults in foreign countries, they do what they're told works. So of course, they try to learn grammar, they try to do study exercises, they try to produce speech, but they end up with the same problem that my friend had doing French, which are those things aren't things that actually get you to become fluent in a language. The reality is, those methods, like using Duolingo, like doing study exercises, like learning grammar, they would be just as ineffective for kids as they are for adults. There's no difference. So it's not that kids just have this capacity of language learning that they lose as they get older. It's that the environments they find themselves in are way different than the environments adults find themselves in. And there is no age at which getting massive amounts of input in the language you're trying to learn at a level you understand doesn't work. It works at every age that you could possibly be, except dead. That's not really an age. If you're trying to learn a language, all you need is massive amounts of authentic input in the language you're trying to learn at a level you understand. And that last part's the most important part, at a level you understand. If you just get blasted in the face with a native Spanish movie and you don't even know the basics of Spanish, you're gonna be lost. You need someone who comes down to your level, who tries to explain things in a very simple and basic way, like we do with children. And that's why when we look at comprehensible input videos, super beginner videos are that. They basically look like they're made for babies, because in a way they are. They're made for people who haven't yet connected sounds to meaning, because that's what language is. Language is a bunch of sounds that I make from my mouth that correspond to meaning. And as you're learning the language, you're trying to find the meaning behind the sounds. And what can help you in the beginning is expressiveness, is images, is miming. And they're super important in the beginning because they help us connect sounds to meaning. They give us a bridgeway. A lot of people are under the impression they learn their second language in a way completely different than their first language, but that's just not true. Every language you learn, you'll learn the same way. It's not that your second language will have to be translated at all times through the medium of your first language. No, you'll learn it the same way. You'll connect the sounds of the language you're trying to learn with meaning directly in your head, just like you did with your native language. If you're trying to learn a language in the most natural, effective way, check out my website, Lengualytics, where you can find content specifically for beginners, intermediate, advanced learners, and you can track your progress as you learn with comprehensible input. Comprehensible input is nice and easy to track because it really is just tracking your hours watching content. So you can see yourself getting better and better and better as you consume more and more input you understand. Thank you for watching this video, and I have not thought of an outro yet.